Yeah, no, I mean, I would. The Syed Ibrahim mentioned a point earlier that's very important with regard to sort of the Taliban being firmly rooted in sort of the culture of southern Afghanistan in particular. And I actually have a bit of a story about this.
Yeah.
I was 17 and I went to so I was 17 and I went to Afghanistan. It was 2012. I went to Kandahar. I went to Kabul and Kandahar. But whilst I was in Kandahar, I overheard a conversation whereby members of my family were telling each other, "Oh, we're going to the mosque today because anan Pashto per Taliban lungi tari," which means that they are going to tie a turban on the heads of the Taliban. Now, obviously, like Syed Ibrahim mentioned, you watch your TV, the Taliban generally wear turbans. My reaction was, guys, what the hell? Like, are you serious here? You guys do that in the open? But what they're actually referring to is that students of the religious sciences in Afghanistan, when they complete the memorization of the Quran, which is Islam's holy book, the ceremony, the graduation ceremony, if we can call it that, is tying the turban. So from that, you also hear from Afghan media, a lot of the times you'll hear movement or words, terms like the Taliban movement or armed Taliban. That is to actually distinguish the guys in Qatar at the moment or the guys in Quetta from the actual, the religious Taliban. And so I've read, I mentioned Western academics earlier. So for example, Thomas Barfield in his book, which I love, by the way, it's an amazing book. It has, obviously it's natural to have some level of disagreement with it, but he labeled the Taliban as Salafi. And I feel like a lot of Western academics have sort of come under the influence of war on terror rhetoric, whereby a Muslim, usually Sunni, who has a political consciousness based on his or her religion, wants to see certain principles implemented in society, become Salafi. But by every unit of measurement, it's quite wrong, because the Taliban are not Salafi. They do not adhere to the precepts or the theological standpoints of the Salafi movement.
True, yeah.
Yeah, no, there's several different issues. What the main one is that after 2001, there was a lot of misinformation. A lot of it was purposeful. Some of it was not on purpose. It was just by rumor. That, like you say, they said, okay, Osama bin Laden or whoever, this guy is a Salafi, or this guy is a Wahhabi or whatever. Therefore, everyone who's ever associated with him is that. And the other thing is, the other complicating factor is that in the war on terror, a lot of the allies in the region were the former Soviet bloc, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, and these countries during the late Soviet period, even during the war in Afghanistan, the 80s war, they would refer to exactly what you're saying now. They would just sort of disparagingly refer to any sort of Islamic activism or militancy or whatever as Wahhabi. Yeah. Because Wahhabi doesn't have a good connotation for most of the world.
Yeah.
Yes.
And in very, very few cases was this actually the case. Even among Salafis, there's many different subsections of Salafis. Like you have the sort of Salafi Jihadis, which Sangar was talking about, which are a pretty small group. They're very they had a lot of outsized influence, but they were a pretty small group. There's a lot of Salafis that are basically they stay out of politics. Then there's a lot of Salafis that are ideologically, especially nowadays, there's a lot of backed by Saudi Arabia and a few other countries that are ideologically their whole outlook is based around the fact that you cannot oppose the government in anything, and they are the opposite extreme of the
Actually, the current president of Afghanistan, one of the presidents, Ashraf Ghani, he has many Salafi supporters who live in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, but also here in Europe and UK. They are staunch Salafis and they oppose Taliban, and even people who are verbally critical of the president, they oppose them and they say you are not allowed to criticize the current president because he is a legitimate leader. So this is a yeah.
Is that this school was kind of founded, I guess, maybe in the 90s or 2000s, as a response to Salafi Jihadis, because the Salafi Jihadi thing was that that the ruler who is backed by the US or by whoever is automatically he's an apostate, or he's Dahoud or whatever, tyrant. So he has to be overthrown, and it's your duty to overthrow him. So in order to counter this preacher Rabi al-Madkhali in Saudi Arabia, he took the opposite view, which was that no, if you oppose the government, even if it's like a small sort of thing, then you're like Khawarij, you're an extremist or whatever.
Yeah.
And nowadays this has a lot of especially since the Arab sort of revolts in the 2010s. It's been very heavily promoted by different governments, and I think Libya is the place where it's most notorious, because
Yes.
some of the most bloodthirsty or brutal militias they follow this ideology. Their claim is that this guy, he opposed our
Ruler.
leader, the guy who we recognize as the leader. Therefore, they're Khawarij. Therefore, it's a good thing to
Speaking of rulers, if I may, one interesting point that we need to mention is that currently in Afghanistan we have a government consisting of many jihadi leaders. Yes, one of them is Abdurrab Rasul Sayaf, who is a very famous Salafi leader in Afghanistan. Then we have Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who even participated in the previous elections. And
he didn't do badly. He came third.
Yeah. but we have many jihadi figures who are part of the current political setup in Afghanistan, and these people are also the ones who received the lion's share of financial and support from Osama bin Laden in the 1980s. They basically welcomed him in Afghanistan, and the Arabs were welcomed by him. And very controversial, when Saudi Arabian Mufti Abdulaziz bin Baz, when he allowed the government to basically cooperate with US attack on Iraq, these guys, these Afghan jihadis, along with their Arab patrons, they said that the government of Saudi Arabia is committing an act of Kufr.
Yeah, Hikmatyar, I believe.
Yes.
Sayyaf, I think, was actually pro-Saudi
Yeah.
Arabia.
But Sayaf was very critical of Saudis at that particular moment. And Michael Scheuer, the ex-Al-Qaeda bureau chief of CIA, he has written a book about that particular era. I think it was either in his book or in Steve Cole's book. I'm not sure, but Ahmed Adib is quoted. Ahmed Adib was a prominent figure within Saudi intelligence, and he said, we corrected Rasul Sayaf's name. His name was Abdul Rasul Sayaf. We corrected his name, and now he's telling us that we are heretics. So the issue of criticizing rulers and positioning yourself as a opponent of the rulers, this issue existed within jihadi groups in Afghanistan in the late 80s and early 90s. But now, in the current setup, like when we talk about Al-Qaeda or the situation in Syria, this topic is revived again and again, and different groups and different entities discuss this issue. However, we have to bear in mind that people who may be anti-regime now, they may change their stance in a few years.
Exactly.
So it happened.
I think Afghanistan is notorious for that. You have a coalition of ex-communists, and not just because when the thing is that when we use the word jihadi in our post-2001 status quo, it has very negative connotations.
Yes.
The foremost amongst them being the Twin Towers attack. But what we actually just just for the sake of clarity, just to set the parameters of this, when we say jihadi in this podcast, at least, we're referring to people that partook in the jihad against the Soviets. But what we have are, communists from the 80s and jihadis from the 80s who fought against each other, coming together in a new coalition where all of a sudden they love democracy and human rights. And it's very interesting that the jihadis in this coalition are not, one would say, okay, these are perhaps the more conciliatory, the more moderate, the more modern ones. Quite the opposite.
Yes.
We mentioned, some names. These are, the more, I think it was Sheikh Mohammed Abbas Stanigzeh, who's currently working for the Taliban's political office in Qatar. And in one of his interviews or one of his press conferences, he was saying that he was in Ittihad-e-Islami, which was Sayaf's Mujahideen group, and he would receive regular, orders from Sayaf to not meet with disbelievers, to not speak to disbelievers, and that sort of thing. Obviously now, I don't think Ustad Sayaf has any objections to doing such, because, Afghanistan is quite notorious for people changing their ideological standpoints, with the drop of a hat. But one thing that has always been raised with the Taliban is, once again, the Ikhwani, the Muslim Brotherhood connection. It's worth noting here that Taliban are actually their foes, especially in the 90s. People like Ahmad Shah Massoud, people like Burhanuddin Rabbani, people like Sayaf, people like Gulbuddin. These were all very ardent Ikhwani Muslim Brotherhood ideologues, and these were the people against whom the Taliban fought the fiercest. And indeed, they are still fighting them today. So to call them Salafi, we've established, is pretty wrong on multiple accounts. To call them Ikhwani is also pretty wrong and misleading on multiple accounts.
I would just say one thing about the Ikhwani thing. Obviously, we know in the war in the 1970s and 80s, the sort of Ikhwani leading sort of leaders like the ones you've mentioned, they had a lot of strong international ties. And they were generally very strongly supported internationally. And the Taliban were not, the overwhelming majority of the Taliban were not from this camp.
Yeah.
And then these leaders were generally the ones who fought over, in the 1990s over who gets to rule before the Taliban came. So they were sort of discredited from that too. And actually, the Taliban, when they were in their early phase, they were backed by Pakistan at that time. They were backed by Saudi Arabia and the United Emirates nowadays. Then, which is like the opposite of the traditional of what is now the case, with the UAE is the foremost. It's very hawkish on any sort of Islamist group. But at that time, they were backed by them. And the Taliban even briefly banned a book by Yusuf Qaradawi, the Egyptian sheikh. At that time, they banned it. Nowadays, they are more, and I think this is again, politics, because nowadays, in political terms, when they went to Pakistan, they received a lot of support after 2001 from the Jamaat-e-Islami there, which is Ikhwani, very classical Ikhwani. So even though they're different sort of ideological networks, but there was this sort of cooperation. And I think it was Anand Gopal, who's a researcher on Afghanistan and a journalist, very good journalist. He wrote in a paper, I don't remember which one it was, but he noted this thing that in the 1990s that the Taliban were generally hostile towards the Ikhwanis. In the 2010s, they were they were, for example, condemning the coup against Mohammad Morsi.
Yes.
Yeah. So they're not, they're not Ikhwanis by any stretch, but again, you see politics is leading them to change their stance.
Yeah, but the thing is that being opposed to the coup against Morsi does not really mean that they support Ikhwanis. And one other issue is like Taliban are the leadership consists primarily of people who have received traditional Hanafi training. Like for instance, in the Hujra is basically a living room in southern Afghanistan, in rural areas where there are no really formal madrasas. You have Hujra where mullah, the local mullah, he teaches people stuff. So a lot of these Panch Kitab, and if they are advanced, they study Quduri, which is a concise text in Hanafi law. So this is the background of most of these guys. Some of them obviously proceeded to study at a higher level, like the official Grand Mufti of the Taliban regime, Mufti Abdul Ali Deobandi, was someone who was a graduate of Darul Uloom Deoband. That's and he was the guiding.
Just to clarify to our. Can we just say what Darul Uloom Deoband is?
Yeah. Okay. I'll come to that. Yeah. So Abdul Ali Deobandi was their most important figure theologically. He would issue fatwas and stuff like that on behalf of the Taliban regime, and he had his weekly question and answers on Afghan radio. When he would answer things. With regards to Hanafis, Taliban, and Deobandis and Ikhwan al-Muslimin, what we need to do is make a clear distinction, is that Ikhwan al-Muslimin is a movement, a political movement, and their leaders are generally not traditionally trained scholars. For example, Syed Qutb, who is... Syed Qutb, who is a very important religious authority for the Ikhwanis, was not educated as a scholar of theology and Islamic law or anything, but he wrote really inspiring books, and that made him a very famous ideological leader. Likewise, Abdullah al-Maududi.
I think, I think Professor Burhanuddin Rabbani actually translated Sayyid Qutb's texts.
Yes, he did. Yeah. So Maududi, who was a very important Muslim Brotherhood linked leader from the subcontinent, he was also not a alim, a scholar of Islam. So we have Ikhwanis on the one hand, or the Muslim Brotherhood inspired groups, and then we have groups like Taliban, who have more a traditional development of their leaders as scholars and ulama.
They weren't political groups like the Taliban. They were not primarily political groups.
Exactly. And that's
I actually think sorry, what?
So that's the distinction that we need to make, because if we have right now a entity that is signing an agreement with the United States, and this political entity, whether you call it an organization or a movement, we have to understand that when we discuss its political thought, it is very, very sensitive, because people like to use labels and slogans for very specific purposes, and I think that we need to have this discussion about the ideology behind these movements, so that we can understand, are they able to cooperate and coexist? Are they able to actually reach a agreement or anything? We've seen with Ikhwanis that they go through different stages, and we've seen that they go to different phases, and we have like a more radical and militant aspects to Ikhwanism that eventually developed into Al-Qaeda, and we have a mainstream mainstream, a more pragmatic aspect, yes, of Ikhwanis. We have these groups also in Pakistan, like you have Jamaat Islami, you have Tanzim Islami, and then we have Jamiat Ulama Islam. Yeah, so there are distinctions that need to be made so that we can understand, like with the question in our back of in the back of our mind. Okay, if the Americans and the Taliban signed an agreement, will the Taliban respect this agreement or not? How is their belief system like, and do they actually accept international agreements or not? This question is important. Why? Because obviously when you talk to someone who is Al-Qaeda or Daesh, they don't accept any agreement, international agreements. They reject all international agreements. They say we're not bound by any agreement at all. But that's not the case with groups that are like Taliban and Muslim Brotherhood.